Hello, good evening from Israel. My name is Ashley Perry. I'm an advisor to the Middle East Forum, and I'll be going through some of the major events from the last week connected to Israel. I'm going to start tonight with events that have happened over the last couple of days. In Washington, D.C., we had a historic visit of Mohammed bin Salman, the leader pretty much of Saudi Arabia, coming to DC. He hasn't been to DC since the last Trump administration, and he and his country were pretty unpopular in the interim with the killing of Khashoggi, a Saudi American journalist. He was seen as persona non grata under the Democrats, the Democratic Biden administration. But here he was, not just as a welcome guest in the second Trump administration, but really, if you saw the scenes when he arrived at the White House, it was scenes that I don't think we've seen for any other leader during this Trump administration. Usually we see them approaching some side or back door where Donald Trump on his own receives the leader. We saw that with Netanyahu, we saw that with Keir Starmer and various other leaders. But the leader of Saudi Arabia was welcomed with full fanfare, with Air Force above. We had army, marching, etc., etc. So there was a really strong message to be sent, and it's clear why. From Israel's point of view, everyone was waiting to see what would happen as far as normalization. There had been talk that there would be something moving towards normalization, something towards joining the Abraham Accords. Whether it wasn't going to be normalization. No one in Israel expected at this point to be full normalization or some comment that would basically lead to full normalization. But the question was exactly how far we would move and if we would move at all. And the bottom line is that Israelis, especially Israel officialdom, left pretty much disappointed. There was nothing new in certainly the open discussions between President Trump and MBS. The only thing that was said is, yes, at the right time, we will normalize relations, but only after an irrevocable path towards a Palestinian state. In other words, absolutely nothing new, no forward momentum, nothing at all. There were some analysts who claimed that Israel had asked the Trump administration to at least condition the deal for eventually what was the title of what Americans were giving, the Trump administration was giving to MBS, the famous now F-35 fighters. And there was apparently people in Israel who basically wanted to condition this sale on normalization. But again, that absolutely is not what happened. And quite simply because, as we've seen since the beginning of the Trump administration, President Trump is very transactional. He is trying to get as much investment for the US as possible. So when you have a leader who comes in promising, as he eventually did during those open remarks, not just to bring 600 billion, which was the talk beforehand, but something close to $1 trillion of Saudi investment in the US, simply that was the big headline. That was the thing that swayed the Trump administration and left Israel kind of reeling in the background, because once you promise that sort of sum, pretty much it's very difficult to say, well, can you also do something else as well, something as big as normalization? So it's clear that Israel was very disappointed. There was absolutely nothing new towards normalization. There was this talk of moving forward, some sort of momentum, even perhaps some sort of timeline, but it's clear that absolutely nothing new was said. Once again, the leader of Saudi Arabia spoke about an irrevocable path towards a Palestinian state, and only then could they consider normalization, which pretty much leaves us as we were, which, as I said, left a lot of people in Israel quite disappointed. The biggest shock, I would argue, for Israelis actually was not even to do with normalization, was more to do with the deal of F-35s. When President Trump made a comment to MBS, he said, I know Israel would like to get planes I would like you to get planes of reduced caliber, I don't think that makes you too happy. First of all, it's very rare that these kind of discussions, which are obviously supposed to be discreet and behind the scenes, are relayed so publicly and, as they were. But what is the most important thing here is it was really talking about what's being defined as the end, perhaps with a question mark, to the qualitative military edge. Now, what is the qualitative military edge, otherwise known as the QME, is basically the idea that Israel is a very small country with a very small population, now 10 million, as opposed to the hundreds of millions in the Arab world, and obviously much more than that in the wider Islamic world. And as we know, since 1948, Israel has been threatened by many of its neighbors, fighting wars, 48, 67, 73, etc., etc. And since the Six-Day War, when the US came more into the picture as an ally of Israel, there was an idea that you can never get a quantitative military edge. In other words, larger amounts of soldiers, larger amounts of tanks, larger amounts of fighter jets, etc., etc. So what they should do is basically ensure that Israel always has the qualitative, a higher quality version of some of this hardware that America would sell, not just to Israel, but to some of its neighbors. As we know, ever since the peace agreement with Egypt in 1979, there's been a commitment by America to give a very large number of sums to Egypt to help its military. A lot of this was to do with Cold War thinking, and certainly that's where the qualitative military edge came in, because there was a need for America to supply its greatest ally, which was Israel, with that edge to make sure that not only could it assist the US in the region, but also basically to protect and ensure the future of Israel, because without it, arguably, Israel could have been in trouble. The QME was codified in law in the US in 2008, which basically said that, as I said, there should be a high armaments and military vehicles sent to Israel as to others in the region. But what we saw yesterday from President Trump is perhaps the end of that, by giving one of Israel's neighbors basically the same level of quality, in this case, F-35s, which are the most advanced fighter jets, as it gives to Israel. There's various levels of F, and usually Israel's been given the highest level, and some of its neighbors will be given slightly lower level. The interesting side note is when Israel was given its own F-35s, it actually updated it with its own innovation and invention. And after proving their worth, the Americans actually asked Israel, what are these sort of tinkering did you do to make them even more powerful than when we sent it? And America basically took that and upgraded its own F-35s because of what Israel did. So even without that, perhaps Israel can still maintain a qualitative military edge because of its own invention and innovation. Quite simply, what we saw at the White House yesterday is an end to decades of consistent American policy, whether Democrat or Republican, ensuring Israel had that qualitative military edge to ensure that it could fight its enemies, those who wanted the destruction of the Jewish state, those who wanted to kill Israelis, because, as we see from the map, as we know from the numbers, Israel's never going to win on the quantitative field. So it has to always be that little bit better and have that little bit better equipment than its neighbors. Is it a new era? We'll have to wait and see. We know that after the Abraham Accords were signed, the UAE was also promised F-35s, and to this day, they still haven't been delivered. So we'll have to see if and when they're delivered. We did hear President Trump say this is going to happen and they are going to be delivered pretty soon. But again, we'll see exactly what that happens. But what we also do know is that it's clear that Israel has only a certain amount of standing with President Trump when he wants to do something. The Israel security establishment, defense establishment, made their feelings very, very clear on the sale of the F-35s, the highest level ones, to Saudi Arabia. But we heard almost nothing from the Israeli government and from organizations like AIPAC. There's a feeling that this was a done deal. There's a feeling that there's really no point going against President Trump. You don't want to raise his ire. This is going to happen. The massive check that Saudi Arabia came into town with basically makes everything else irrelevant. But it really does show, to a certain extent, Israel's challenges with this current administration. Yes, most Israelis would say that this Trump administration has done a lot of good things for Israel. Absolutely, that's true, not just of this administration, but the previous one. But it also understands that there is a certain limit now to its ask in the White House. And quite simply, money talks. And Israel, as President Trump made clear, is an important ally, but there are other important allies. And Saudi Arabia is now considered, according at least to what was said yesterday in the White House, is considered on a par with Israel. Israel's concern are not just, MBS is considered a relatively moderate leader. He's seen as someone that Israel can do business and does do business behind the scenes. But one never knows in the shifting sands of the Middle East what comes next. Could he be overthrown? Could there be a coup at one point down the road? Could there be an Islamist threat? Could there be a leader who's not so moderate, perhaps an heir after MBS? He's a relatively young guy, but one never knows what's going to happen. So there's a worry, not just for today, but certainly for tomorrow. But what we saw in the White House yesterday, as I said, really is potentially the end of an era, the end of the QME, which was really what the American-Israel relationship, or much of it, certainly on the defense and security level, has been built on really since 1967, but certainly in the last few decades. Closer to home, the ultra-Orthodox enlistment or non-enlistment issue has come up again. It really is a to and fro about it. Sometimes it seems like things are moving forward, then they're moving backwards. Interestingly enough, there seemed to be some momentum from the ultra-Orthodox side when at least half of the Ashkenazi United Torah Judaism Party, the Lithuanian non-Hasidic wing, basically gave a green light to start moving forward on the Boaz Bismuth's law. The Hasidic part, led by former Minister Golkanov, has basically said, we haven't even seen a version of it, so we can't move forward. Shas are the most gung-ho. They're supporters of it. A former MK of theirs, Ariel Atias, a former minister, was one of those who worked on this law with Boaz Bismuth, but it's caused a certain amount of consternation within Shas. Shas has, even during the years of Rav Ovadia Yosef, was pretty much Aryeh Deri ran the show. Yes, Rav Ovadia Yosef was the spiritual figure and loomed large all the time, but Aryeh Deri was the one really pulling the strings. And ever since Rav Ovadia Yosef passed, it was considered Aryeh Deri's basically fiefdom. He could do what he wants when he wanted. But now on this enlistment issue, it seems that there seems to be some pushback, some more hardliners in the party, on the spiritual council at least, have basically said that Aryeh Deri is going too far. He's bending over a little bit. He's being a little bit too compromising on this, and we shouldn't let him run ahead. There's been a lot of antagonism left, right, and center. One of the Shas members of Knesset was physically attacked as he left his home in a car by ultra-Orthodox extremists. So it seems that there is still a lot of doubt within the ultra-Orthodox community, and that's probably led to the fact that Netanyahu has pulled the brakes on the law, simply because, as I've said, we are in an election year. Now, elections have to take place less than a year, and Netanyahu doesn't want to spend significant political capital on an unpopular issue that won't even pass. If he believes that there's a good chance of passing it, he will pass it just to ensure that the ultra-Orthodox parties return to the government, that the budget is passed, and he knows that then he'll have a nice 9 to 10 months ahead of elections to try and get achievements elsewhere and distract the public from a very unpopular enlistment law. So at the moment, it seems, despite some momentum on the ultra-Orthodox side, there's clearly not enough for Netanyahu, and he's basically waiting to see if he can encourage more support for this and then try and get it through the Knesset, which won't be so simple, because even within his own party, there is a significant number of opposition to this non-enlistment law. But certainly he doesn't want to go to war, even within his own party, to go and really, as I said, go to war to a certain extent with a significant amount of the public who have served for the last 2 years in this devastating war. So we'll have to wait and see exactly what happens with that. But the reason I keep on bringing up this issue, because it is not necessarily going to be the issue of the next elections, but it is indicative of Netanyahu's clock. If he's able to pass it, it tells us something. If he's not able to pass it, that tells us something else about the clock going into next year's election. So with that, I'm going to go to the chat and see what questions. And let's go to the top. Can you comment on Israeli threat perception on Iraq? Does Israel expect a new front on Iraq? Not really. The Shiite groups in Iraq have attacked Israel, but really they're at the back of the line. They're behind Hamas, they're behind Hezbollah, they're behind the Houthis, they're behind Islamic Jihad, and etc. Their interests are more national. Yes, there is, that we're talking about Shiite groups. There's a debate to be had whether they are run from Tehran, whether they're independent, but I don't think their major interests and their major raison d'etre, unlike Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, is just, to seek the destruction of the state of Israel, at least one of its major purposes. So I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. Iraq is very weak. I don't think the leadership want to see happen in Iraq what Israel has done in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iran, and the Iraqi leadership know that Israeli planes can pretty much reach wherever they want to in Iraq, as they have done in the past. So I don't think there's going to be a front in Iraq any time sooner. By the way, that question was by Barak Korkmaz. David Levine asks, Indonesia keeps showing up in many headlines hinting at possible recognition of Israel. Can you comment on this? I've always said that Indonesia will be one of the next few joining the Abraham Accords. I do believe that they will need, to a certain extent, the cover of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, even though it's not the most populous Muslim country, Indonesia has that title. Saudi Arabia is the most important Muslim and Arab country. And once they join the Abraham Accords, once there is normalization with Saudi Arabia, it will give cover for those nations, which will quite happily join soon after. And I would say Indonesia is like that. Indonesian leadership behind the scenes understand that Israel can play a role against their common enemy, Islamist terrorism, etc. In Indonesia itself, there has been a growing Islamist threat and a more, let's call it, Arabization of Islam. Indonesia historically had a more moderate version of Islam, but in recent years, or perhaps even a decade or two, that has changed. And as we see it in politics, they've certainly grown. If we saw in the last leadership, Joko Widodo, former president of Indonesia, his greatest ally was basically who was the mayor of Jakarta, who was one of the most popular figures in the country, was basically taken to town by the Islamists. He made a comment about the Quran and he was deemed a blasphemer and he went to prison. This was one of the most close people to the president. And from that moment on, it was understood that Islamists had an important political power within the country. So whereas many of the people wouldn't necessarily be, in favor of normalization with Israel, the leadership on the whole has less of a problem. There was talk of Prabowo, the current Indonesian president, coming to Israel on a visit. And the fact that, as David Levine mentions, that keeps on showing up shows that there is some understanding of it. We heard Prabowo say shalom and certain other positive things from the UN stand a couple of months ago. So again, the bottom line is, I think Indonesia will be there, but I think they probably need the cover of Saudi Arabia at this point. And as I mentioned earlier, Saudi Arabia doesn't seem to be even inching towards normalization. Yes, it's there, but it's asking for something which it's clear this government cannot give. And as we understand from some commentators, the Saudis are actually even aware of this and are thinking that we can only probably normalize with a future Israeli government. So they're waiting for after elections. Also, they don't want to be seen as an issue in the campaign. One can imagine that Netanyahu would run very strongly on the fact that he was able to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia, and that would be something that NBS and the Saudis would be a little bit uncomfortable with. Carrie Hillebrand asked, do you see the Knesset passing the draft exemptions for Haredim, ultra-Orthodox bill in the near future? As I said, there are a lot of moving parts to this. There's three different groups involved. There's the Hasidic, the non-Hasidic, Ashkenazi part who run together under United Torah Judaism, and there's Shas. Things are moving forward. There is a draft. There is understanding and agreement with Shas and with at least half of the Ashkenazi party, who at least their rabbis have given a green light to move forward. They haven't given a green light for the final version in support of the law, but certainly they've given a tepid green light, let's say a yes, but the Hasidic part of that party hasn't even given that at the moment. So there is forward momentum, but at the moment it's about timing. We're towards the end of the year. The budget discussions already started. There has to be a budget passed at the end of March. Netanyahu wants desperately the ultra-Orthodox to come back to the government. In fact, the High Court or the Attorney General basically said the time after ministers resign to fill that position has already passed. So these positions have to be filled. But that's something Netanyahu doesn't want to think about. He just wants them back in the government as soon as possible. So I don't see it happening tomorrow or next week, but things could change. There is a lot of work being done on that with Netanyahu's approval. And if he feels that he can pass something, I believe he will try to, even though, again, it might prove difficult even within his Likud party. Other questions? Okay. Eric Selkov asks, can you talk about the recent UN resolution? I'm assuming this is for the international force. It's something that Israel wasn't in favor of certain aspects of it. And again, it's one of those things that President Trump had already made his mind up on it, and Israel knew that it was going to happen. So it didn't really come out too strongly against it. There were more extreme elements in this government who did come out against it for various reasons, chief among them the fact that it talks about a Palestinian state and even sort of creates a pathway to the Palestinian state, although we need to see a reform of the Palestinian Authority, something that many Israelis do not think will happen. But the crux of it is Israel didn't necessarily oppose it. Yes, there were minor ripples within the government, but we saw Israel's ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, himself quite hawkish, although in his position he's supposed to just reflect government policy. And his comments welcomed the passage of the Security Council resolution. The big question is what happens next. And for many Israelis, the idea that an international force will come in and disarm Hamas is just unrealistic, as much as, Hezbollah haven't been disarmed by the Lebanese army. No one expects any foreign soldiers or whatever, peacekeepers or whatever they are, to disarm Hamas. Hamas have said that they will not disarm on their own. So it just doesn't seem likely. The question is then what happens? Is the IDF given a freer hand? These are discussions which are taking place. What happens if the Trump plan doesn't work, or at least some of the key elements for Israel in phase 2? We're still waiting for phase 1 to finish because, as we know, there are 3 hostage remains still in Gaza. But the most important thing for Israel in phase 2 is that Hamas disarms and the Strip is demilitarized. And quite simply, no Israeli believes that that's going to happen, certainly not with an international military force or whatever it is. So the question is, what happens then and what's the timetable on it? But the fact is, it's now a reality. There's this so-called Board for Peace led by President Trump himself. But as I said, we'll have to wait and see exactly what happens, because at the moment it seems unrealistic sitting here in Israel, especially as we heard tonight again, today I should say, that Hamas again broke the ceasefire by shooting at IDF soldiers, actually from 2 different areas today, into the area beyond the yellow line, into IDF controlled area, sniper fire, trying to kill IDF soldiers. They didn't succeed, but Israel's response was robust and tried to take out 2 senior Hamas officials. It remains to be seen whether they were actually killed. But Israel took the response that even though no IDF soldier was killed, the fact that there was sniper shooting and an attempt to kill IDF soldiers across the agreed on ceasefire line shows that Israel's response is robust. I'm sure that there was an agreement with the US on how to respond, and they probably didn't do it without some sort of green light, or at least an amber light from the White House to respond. But it just shows how Hamas are regrouping. They do feel more robust since the ceasefire. And it's certainly causing a lot of consternation in Jerusalem, exactly how they work this out. And the UN resolution with this creation, theory at least, of this international force ties Israel's hands to a certain extent. So publicly, they've welcomed it, this Security Council resolution, but behind the scenes, there is certainly a high level of concern and worry as to exactly how this is implemented. And with that, I think we've run out of time. I'd like to say thank you for all of those who have joined us and your questions. And I look forward to seeing you at the same time next week. Have a good day.